morning. Thank you to Chris for inviting me. Thank you to the residents of Iqaluit for welcoming us, although you tried to keep us away, I noticed. Of course, in the world of the Inuit impact and benefit agreements are Inuit impact and benefit agreements, but throughout this talk I will, I'm afraid, refer to IBAs because they exist right across the country. And a little bit of semantics, I'm a fan of impact and benefit agreement as opposed to merely impact benefit. The latter sounds a little bit like you're getting benefits because of impact, but indeed a good agreement seeks to do two things. It seeks to better mitigate the impacts associated with development and to deliver benefits. So in that sense, there are two agreements in one. Was anyone at the announcement early last month for the Baffinland IIBA? There's one, yes. What was the mood like? Was it?
Excited.
Yes. Yes, and these sort of images are presented quite frequently where there's a press release. I'm sorry if the image isn't great. I don't know if we can turn off any lights, but then you'll all fall asleep. There's always lots of energy and excitement and grand expectations. Some of those expectations are made explicit. Others are merely implicit, never given voice, never part of the negotiations, and hence never part of the IBA. And there's real concern based on the experience with impact and benefit agreements over the last 2 decades that they very seldom meet the expectations. And this was brought to national attention with the housing crisis in Attawapiskat about 1.5 years ago, when listeners of radio and viewers of television were surprised to realize that Attawapiskat was next door to a diamond mine which had been delivering millions of dollars over the prior 6 years. And so the question around how do we ensure that these novel instruments of governance actually meet expectations is a critical one, both for knowledge and for practice. Last year in Whitehorse, Chris asked me to try and pull together some knowledge and practice gaps, both as they emerge from existing scholarship and as they emerge from the use of IBAs by communities and firms. And I've been grateful for some of the feedback I've received since that presentation. Now, when I refer to knowledge gaps in the rest of this presentation, I'm talking about knowledge and practice gaps, because certainly they are both close. It's not often I get to reflect on where research has been and where it needs to go in a room filled with people who are knowledgeable. So I'm going to stretch my 10 minutes to 12 minutes. If you're bored, please show your sign by just getting up and getting coffee, and I'll pick up the pace. That's a subtle way to send me a signal. But what I'd like to do in the subsequent slides is identify some knowledge gaps that many of you and others were able to suggest are indeed pertinent in red, and look at some current initiatives that I think many of you would be pleased to learn about, or many of you might be familiar with, which I'll cover in green. In terms of those areas in which there are some outstanding gaps, the one legal related gap in knowledge that seems to be pertinent is around the relationship between IBAs and the Crown's duty to consult and accommodate and the regulatory process. And indeed, this emerged as a hot issue in the news just couple of weeks ago, as reported by CBC North, because we have 2 developments around Yellowknife which have received approvals through the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board, but do not have a complete set of IBAs secured. And in the case of Klitzelke, a letter sent to the minister responsible for the process saying, look, we're not satisfied with what's happened, and in particular, we don't feel like the review process has sufficiently fulfilled the Crown's duty to consult and accommodate. And when you talk to regulators and certain industry types, they'll say, no, there's no consultation and accommodation through an IBA. There's no rules around IBAs. These things just happen because we're a benevolent bunch. But ironically, when Avalon was able to secure one IBA for their rare earth project, it was named an accommodation agreement, which of course mirrors exactly the duty to consult and accommodate language. So this whole question around how do IBAs fit in a legal sense? What is their relationship to the Crown's duty to consult and accommodate? Should be their relationship to environmental assessment is, I think, a critical question to answer. And that's a question of knowledge and practice, because there are certain jurisdictions where that relationship seems to be operating a little bit more smoothly. Another interesting question is around the role of government in impact and benefit agreement negotiation and implementation. For years, government said this is none of our business, we stay out of it. But more recently, they've started to acknowledge that, of course, they play a central role in enabling good or bad agreements. And I'm pleased to say that for the first time in 10, 15 years of me knocking on the door, Natural Resources Canada is now keen to be involved in improved knowledge generation and practice around impact and benefit agreements. They're doing a couple of things. One is sponsoring some knowledge exchange where they're highlighting those communities and tribal councils that they see as being effective in the development of IBAs, in particular the Waban Tribal Council based in Timmins in Northern Ontario, and helping them to tell their story and spread that story. So they're cherry picking, that's their prerogative because they're paying the bill. But nevertheless, I think it's a useful exercise. The other thing they're trying to do is to fund some applied research drawing on the knowledge of so-called thought leaders around enablers of community beneficial mining, recognizing that mining doesn't, through trickle down, generate good outcomes, and that there has to be some more systematic attention to the necessary conditions under which mining seems to generate some benefits. And I'm not going to go into this, but essentially they're sort of trying to create some kind of a normative framework that puts various obligations on industry, governments, and communities to do things, to have things in place in advance, to do things during the construction and operation phase, such that you can maximize opportunities. Now, one of the challenging questions, of course, is around consent. That would say no to any kind of a development. And that's a key element of this governance framework, but one that is a rather contentious issue. And you saw that as one of the other knowledge gaps, but one that isn't, I don't think, addressable at this stage. Lots of good things happening at the provincial level. I will simply highlight what's happening in Ontario. For the first time, we have mining legislation that recognizes and thereby, in my mind, supports impact and benefit agreements, what they refer to as arrangements. And the Mining Act actually makes provisions which suggest that those arrangements need to be shown to the regulator to ensure that the regulator's obligations, especially around the duty to consult and accommodate, are fulfilled. So interesting there. The other activity is investment in so-called community preparedness, which again has a bias towards approving developments, but nevertheless, community preparedness, certainly we are familiar with the training and monies that are being spent. But I think, interestingly, it's worth noting that Ontario is also sponsoring the development of thoughtful well-being baselines against which changes can be measured in the future. And we have two projects with Webequie First Nation and Yamatang First Nation, where we've gone in and sought to identify community values, concerns, and expectations around mining, translate those into indicators using their own personnel, a steering committee typically made up of health workers and social workers and education types, to identify some of the ways in which they want to measure change, and then use that as the basis of a household survey, asking questions like, do your children under 12 play outside without supervision? Has your home been vandalized in the last 12 months? And we were pleased in the first round in Yamatang to have about 75% of the households participating with nothing more than a $30 grocery voucher. And so for the first time, Yamatang has information on indicators such as frequency of sharing foods with other households. If this can be done every 2-3 years, they're in a greenfield setting. If development were to occur, this becomes a useful tool and is wholly consistent with what you've heard here from Andre and others, and certainly Thierry is doing this kind of work. The knowledge sharing piece is critical. To what degree are new IBAs being informed by thoughtful community visions about what could be? How do they get themselves organized? Information sharing among communities is happening, certainly, and there's some nice examples of that have already been presented. And in part, it's because this has become a hot topic. There are a number of agencies that are seeking to enable that kind of community sharing. I don't think I have to introduce the IBA Community Toolkit to any of you, developed by Ginger Gibson, a co-author of this presentation, and Kieran O'Farquharly. Sections 2 and 3 pay deliberate attention to, if you will, community preparedness, what needs to be in place before you start negotiating, and I think that's of critical importance. There's a significant proposal that's been developed by the Assembly of First Nations, which is sitting on the minister's desk at NRCan, to fund a First Nations virtual resource center, which would be a database of knowledge. They want to be, at least for First Nations, the distributor of information around mining and health and IBA negotiations and the issues of consent. Equivalent exercises, databases could be developed. I've had initial conversations with IQ and Inuit Patuti to see if they would host an equivalent, sort of, if you will, database. We've had our own project through the Canadian Business Ethics Research Network with the Naskapi Nation, where we took a couple of years to figure out what it is that they wanted to know that they didn't know about mining developments, and then have been delivering on those questions in a variety of formats. And then Thierry drew attention to a new network, of course, that has a similar aim. We had one exercise, you're not supposed to be able to read this, I'm sorry, it's just, we had one exercise sponsored by CAHR to try and make sense of existing knowledge on the purported community health implications of mining. And we have generated a number of outputs, such as, you know, posters that are a little bit boring to read, radio programs in Baker Lake, and community workshops, and then most usefully gatherings, which if you are able to afford 5 caribou, draw out. Even here, I was quite pleased to attract Joan Scotty, who is an exception to the rule, is a leader with the Hunters and Trappers Association in Baker Lake, and has been highly suspect of me, but I was able to get her out for the first time this year and make a little bit of progress. So some useful ways to cannot focus. Keep going, there we go. There are lots of ways, of course, to do that kind of knowledge mobilization, and we've had a little bit of success there. IBA implementation is one of the most thorny issues, and it's an interesting question as to how you address that. In terms of existing initiatives, that's the content of Chapter 5 of the IBA Community Toolkit. With the 10-year review of Voisey's Bay being undertaken by the Nunatsiavut government, I think there's a real opportunity there to review best practice, given that their IBA implementation officer, Teresa Howlett, has been probably the expert, the leading expert on implementation of IBAs, especially around training and employment provisions. And so I think there's much that can be learned there, and their review is ongoing. This question of effectiveness, are they delivering that which they were supposed to deliver, is hugely challenging. So hence we have lots of pertinent questions that emerge here. How do we address that question? Is itself a question? Are IBAs ultimately benefiting communities? The billion-dollar question is, look, can mining act as an agent of sustainable community development? If so, under what conditions might that be achieved? That's an empirical question that hasn't been answered. And we know, based on long-standing indicator programs, such as the Community and Diamonds programs, that mining does present opportunities for enrichment. I don't think anyone questions that. The challenge is really, does it lead to greater health? And I appreciate the work of my colleague Kathleen Kanash, who with the National Aboriginal Health Organization, before it was shut down, posited this provocative question. Look, are communities healthier as a result of their use of IBAs? Are they healthier as a result of their engagement with the mining sector? And that question can't be answered with much of the existing data. And I'm pleased to see that many of those well-being questions are now being included in indicator work. And so this was true of our work in Northern Ontario. It's also been true of some work we've been able to do with Baker Lake, given the presence of the Meadowbank gold mine just to the north of the hamlet. Quite thoughtfully, the renegotiated IIBA for Meadowbank has got a provision that requires the generation of an annual wellness report and implementation plan. By implementation plan, they mean adaptation. And that was designed specifically for Baker Lake. It was the only provision in the IIBA that's specific for Baker Lake. And it requires that the developer, Agnico Eagle Mines, offer an annual report and do so through personal interviews, focus group sessions, surveys, and case studies of the residents of Baker Lake. I encouraged Agnico Eagle to commission the hamlet to do the work rather than give it to a consultant. And so we've been able to work with the hamlet to try and deliver on that annual reporting. And rather than just do a snapshot each year, we suggested that this would be an opportunity to develop some community relevant indicators of health and to try and track those over time to see what's happening. Now, it's not a greenfield setting, of course. The baseline should have been done back in 2000, but nevertheless, there's some opportunities here to go back, once we have indicators developed, go back and look for existing data or proxies that might be able to help us fill in some of that information. And so those indicators were developed last summer and fall. by a couple of RAs, one a Guelph student and one a resident of Baker Lake. And they've just been submitted to the Hamlet and Agneguigo mines and should be on the NERV website within a few weeks, if approved by the KIA as part of that annual submission to them. Finally, the outstanding ones is again around this question of the legal basis. Is there an opportunity to better harmonize environmental assessment and IBA negotiations? So it's around the whole question of good governance and of course the Crown's consultation duties. And then one of the great challenges that for at least 50% of the analysts of IBAs, the reviewers and their participants, for them IBAs represent more of the same, notwithstanding their novel nature. There's perpetuation of social injustice. And so we always must be open to alternative arrangements. IBAs emerge in a sense spontaneously out of governance gaps. The question becomes what else is possible? What are the next steps? And I think that's always a pertinent question to be asking. So thank you for bearing me out, and only one of you, a former grad student, went to get coffee, so that's a good sign. I'm finished here, but I will try and summarize what I see as the areas where ReSDA can really contribute. And I think quite thankfully, much of the work is about mobilizing existing knowledge, and in some instances we have some new knowledge to generate. On the mobilization side, I think the whole question around mining and community health, and especially with a focus on interventions, what do we know in terms of mitigation strategies that work so that we can start to develop adaptive management instead. There's no point in tracking changes in conditions if we aren't prepared to intervene to change when things don't look as we hoped. There needs to be more knowledge mobilization around best practices of IBA implementation, learning from those settings, those jurisdictions where IBAs have been not only better designed, but better implemented. I'm not sure how this is done, so I'm definitely looking for insights here, but how do you enable adaptive socioeconomic management? It's quite depressing to see, although I applaud the work of environmental scientists and their community partners over the years, the expectations around environmental monitoring, development of dynamic baselines, adaptive management are so significant as compared to that which is expected by regulators for socioeconomic impacts. So we have to be able to enable that. And then I would suggest, given the number of initiatives that are developing indicators, especially more novel community wellness indicators, that ReSDA could develop a consistent platform to host those indicators and present results in a web-based format to those who want it. Finally, on the knowledge generation side, I'd love to ask for funding from ReSDA, if they would provide it, to enable the execution of some of these wellness assessments in Baker Lake and with the Naskapi Nation. In both cases, we have indicators developed, but the household surveying hasn't been done. So supporting some of that research as a case study or as a pilot project. I think a detailed case study assessment with colleagues of the Voisey's Bay project 10 years in, especially around issues of implementation and good governance, I think would be useful. And finally, sort of a big picture thought piece using a policy Delphi, engaging indigenous leadership, industry, regulators to talk about what could be ideally the governance arrangements to improve the current conflictual relationship between the Crown's duties to consult and accommodate IBAs and the EA process. So thank you for your patience. I'd really appreciate it if I've got it right. More importantly, I'd like to hear if I've got it wrong. If you'd like to do that anonymously, just slip a note. And if anyone is looking to collaborate. Thanks. And this